As the United States continues to position more of its chess pieces around Venezuela, we are at risk of having worlds collide. Remember, the battle map is complicated, and Venezuela and Russia are on the same side here. So if the United States does indeed take some type of military action against Venezuela, a natural question to ask is whether Russia might intervene on behalf of its South American friend. Perhaps unsurprisingly, reports indicate that Venezuela is asking for just that. Now, I know what you are thinking here. There is no way that the Kremlin would do such a thing. Not as a matter of principle, of course. Rather, Russia is just too bogged down in Ukraine to even consider the possibility. However, it is not that simple. Russia has a surprising amount of freedom here, because the domain of a potential US-Venezuela war is perhaps 50% different than what we see over in Ukraine. And, indeed, Putin has already taken a preliminary step as a show of support to Maduro. So, today, let's discuss Russia's decision here on three fronts: the materiel question, the distance question, and the political question. And although it would be easy to conclude that the first one is what will ultimately drive the Kremlin's decision, it is actually more the latter two. But let's start with the materiel question, because it will put significant bounds on what Russia can do to help. The narrative you tend to hear is something along the lines of Russia putting in all the effort it can, only to move the line a relatively small distance every month. By this thinking, if Moscow moves money and mobilizes materiel to maintain Maduro's mandate, then these gains will start to fall apart. Heck, maybe they will even reverse. But this is not the right way to frame the problem. Instead, as a starting point, we need to ask ourselves what the threat to Venezuela is, and what assistance would be useful to counteract the problem. Well, the United States has moved a flotilla of naval assets to the region, and it is also using Puerto Rico as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Consequently, Venezuela's top priorities are anti-ship weapons and air defenses. Those air defenses double to not only shoot down enemy aircraft, but to also intercept the ship-based missiles that the United States might lob over. I am sure Maduro on some level is worried about a US ground campaign, but the United States is not really set up for that. Rather, the likely theory of victory is that enough aerial shock and awe will encourage opposition groups to rise up and do the dirty work. So, although Maduro would not refuse weapons to bolster his infantry and halt US boots on the ground, that is a low priority. And that is a good thing for him. Because of these three options, it is the least likely type of support that Russia would offer due to the needs for the Ukraine war. One thing to note here is that I am focusing on Russia, though Maduro has sought assistance from China and Iran as well. But with the help of today's returning sponsor, Ground News, it is easier than ever to keep important information from falling through the cracks. For example, left-leaning outlets kept the spillover focus on Ukraine, whereas right-leaning outlets put China and Iran front and center. Actually, Ground News' blind spot feature targets this exact problem, letting you see, for example, the right's lack of coverage of a refinery attack, more on that later, or the left underreporting the development of a Russian naval drone. You can even switch to the international blind spot feed to ensure that you see the stories that you care about the most. What's this? US military action in Nigeria? Yikes, the big board keeps growing. But that is why it is great to have an independent news aggregator help you find new information and research the accuracy of the reporting outlets. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take an excellent 40% off their Vantage plan, which gives you access to the blind spot feed and a whole lot more. So thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to the remaining options. Option 2 is also a non-starter because of Ukraine's air campaign. This is the latest update to the refinery and gas pipeline targeting. I told you we would circle back to this topic. And I should note that the rate on these feels like it is falling off a bit. But it seems that is because Ukraine is choosing to strike arms production facilities and the Russian electrical grid more often. Those do not create as impressive of explosions, so they do not receive the same level of social media attention. In fact, some of these refinery strikes had one or two other types of strikes paired with it on the same night. But the general point here is that the Russian skies are porous, and so the Kremlin is not itching to donate those defenses to the Venezuelan cause. That leaves anti-ship weapons, which is where things get more interesting. Do you know what Ukraine does not have? A navy. So all of those Soviet-era anti-naval weapons that Russia inherited remain untouched in their warehouses, in stark contrast to all of the army stuff. So yes, there is a clear opportunity for Russia to send some weapons over to Venezuela. But there is a point of irony here. All of the innovation on this front from the last 4 years has been on Ukraine's end. Think about all of the naval drones finding Russian ships sitting in the Black Sea, or a certain Crimean bridge. I am not sure that this elevates Ukraine in Venezuela's mind as the better partner, but there is something to be said about recognizing your role in an asymmetric conflict against the United States. One more question mark. The situation with Shahed drones. The question is not on Venezuela's end. The main Washington Post report on the subject explicitly has long-range drones on the Maduro government's wish list. The question is what Russia thinks of it. To give you an idea of the geography, the length of Ukraine is significantly longer than the distance between Venezuela and Puerto Rico. 1. That tells you that Venezuela could try some counter-value targeting to retaliate to any strikes made on the country. But 2. The more interesting question is whether Venezuela would try aiming them at the US Armada. That is a bit of a rabbit hole, so let me limit this point to how Yemen attempted to target US assets near the Bab el-Mandab Strait with various drones, to little effect. You see, it is easier to jam enemy systems when they are flying out over the water. Nonetheless, it would be interesting to watch how AI targeting could interact there. Of course, this presupposes that Russia would send Shaheds over there in the first place. I think we can say definitively that the Kremlin would not simply give them away. Shaheds are too much a part of Russia's counter-infrastructure strategy in Ukraine. But it would not be out of the question for Venezuela to buy them. Right now, Russia is certainly cash-constrained, but it does not appear constrained on the raw material front. It is not crazy to think that Russia might take whatever money Venezuela can offer and invest it in constructing more Shahed factories. Then Russia can take those profits and use them to run overnight shifts on those factories to produce Shaheds to fire at Ukraine. The war economy at work. One problem. Venezuela wants to buy on credit, according to the Washington Post. That would be a tough sell for 2 reasons. 1. Russia does not have the liquidity to do this. It needs money right now. It is not interested in taking on investments when it is struggling to make payroll for its current war. 2. If the United States indeed starts a war and quickly dispatches of Maduro, there is no guarantee that Russia will see any of the returns on investment. The money, therefore, may be the bigger sticking point than the availability of the weapons themselves. Regardless of the depth of support Russia has available to offer, we need to get to the more serious problem, the tyranny of distance. It is tempting to look at this from a US perspective, note that they are just moving a bunch of stuff around, and conclude that this should all be super easy. The problem for the Kremlin is that Russia is just not set up for this, and it never was either. Go back to the days of the Cold War, and the central Soviet concern was moving troops and materiel through Eastern Europe. Crossing oceans was never really a consideration. Then there was a brief period as the Cold War was ending, and continuing into its immediate aftermath, where Moscow stopped caring about power projection generally. Fast forward to today, and Russia is once more interested in moving troops and materiel, but again through Eastern Europe, albeit for different reasons. What remains the same is that oceans are not a consideration. Internally, Russia's system is set up to focus on rail transit, which makes sense given that Russia is thinking about fighting land wars. Russia itself is a gigantic hunk of land, and rail is cheaper and easier once you have the lines installed. Of course, Russia takes on some expeditionary missions, primarily in Africa, lest we forget about the rise of Yevgeny Prigozhin. But the key words are some and expeditionary. These are not materiel-intensive projects like the type of assistance that Venezuela would want. There is also a problem of timing. Once a war between the United States and Venezuela breaks out, any attempted Russian deliveries must go through an active war zone. This is not Ukraine, where you can simply drive donations safely across the border with Poland. Rather, anything flown in or sailed in is likely to be shot down or torpedoed. This makes the window for Russian assistance brief. The Kremlin needs to strongly suspect a war is about to begin, but the war cannot have begun yet. If Russia did not have its attention diverted in Ukraine, then there might be a more concerted effort going on right now as uncertainty about US goals looms. As it stands, though, it is not obvious that the United States will actually follow through on its deployment. In turn, Russia has limited its support effort to a single flight into Venezuela for an unknown delivery. If the situation were to degrade, though, Russia's window may only be open for a few days. That might entirely rule out naval-based deliveries. Ships would need more than a week to make the cross-Atlantic journey, and that is assuming that the would-be donations are already conveniently sitting at the port of departure. That leaves air deliveries, with the IL-76 serving as the workhorse system. But that comes with 3 significant caveats. 1, and referencing the previous section, it is unclear whether Russia has IL-76 flight hours to spare. They are a part of the war effort in Ukraine, and even though the Soviet Union made a ton of them, juggling their use across a couple of different conflicts is problematic because of the 2 remaining points. Indeed, the second issue is the long journey the IL-76 would have to make. You see, the ideal flight path would have to take Russian planes directly over Europe. That is a non-starter, however. Europe has closed its airspace to Russian traffic. NATO allies are just barely tolerating Russian incursions, and those are not trying to deliver weapons of war. As such, Russia will have to take the long way, about 26 hours of total flight time, plus however many hours on the ground for refueling and mechanical inspection. Russia can shave off some time there by cutting corners, but that is a lot to ask when the goal here is to mostly annoy the United States. For a point of comparison, the one visit to Venezuela so far first stopped in Armenia, Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Mauritania. It took 2 days going one way. It is not clear whether the airports hosting the layovers have the capacity to scale up if Russia tried to do this with multiple IL-76s simultaneously. I would imagine that the airports that they would use would be better than the one from the stock video seen here. But the point is that Russia does not have a simple logistical problem. This is not like the Berlin airlift, where you can just fly things across a border. And there is some historical forgetfulness there, because that airlift was not easy either, despite the close access. So if you were wondering why Russia tried so hard to keep a friendly Syrian government in power, and with that, access to an airbase, that is your answer. And the final point underscores the need for a massive airlift. Each one of those planes has significant weight limits. If we are looking at tanks or armored personnel vehicles as a point of comparison, then we are thinking about 1 or 2 max per plane. Not exactly what Maduro would be hoping for. And that provides an important connection to our final point, the political problems that Putin prefers to postpone. For more than 9 months, Russia has succeeded in keeping the United States on the sidelines of the Ukraine conflict. Essentially, Putin has been capitalizing on the Trump administration's desire to shift policy focus to the Indo-Pacific, genuflecting just enough to give Trump some political cover to not put greater pressure on Russia. There are some obvious cracks forming there, though, both with reports that their Alaska summit turned into a shouting match, and the United States supplying intelligence to facilitate Ukraine's air campaign. An outright intervention would completely rupture those cracks. Unlike Russia's bottleneck in Ukraine, fighting in Venezuela will not significantly reduce the type of assistance that the United States could send to Europe. There might be some pain points, like with Tomahawk missiles, But those are specific and not universal problems. As a result, the Kremlin faces some significant downside risks to assisting Venezuela. In turn, the only way to justify helping Venezuela is if the upshot is large, and that is where the distance problem comes back to quash this plan. Any airlift at all is liable to sever the peace process that the Kremlin has been stringing along. Due to the distance and cargo limitations, a Russian assistance program is unlikely to meaningfully alter the balance of power between the United States and Venezuela. Would it have an effect at the margins? Sure. Under normal circumstances, would that be worth the cost of investment to Russia? Probably. But that is not the world that we live in today. And all of that is pointing to the strategy being a bad idea. Meanwhile, you know what is a good idea? Taking 40% off a Ground News Vantage plan by clicking the link in the video description or scanning the QR code on your screen. Thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support. And if you enjoyed today's well-grounded video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.